This panel is called They Like to Watch, Embracing Interactive Fiction as a Spectator Sport. Michael Anderson is the owner of ARGN.com, a website that provides coverage on alternative reality games, transmedia storytelling, puzzle hunts, escape rooms, and other types of stories that cross multiple platforms. He has also deployed an unapproved banner ad network in his office restrooms and launched an office ghost hunting society through an elevator ad.
They like to watch, embracing interactive fiction as a spectator sport. Before I get into this, I did want to start out by thanking the NarraScope team because they have gone over incredible hurdles over the last couple weeks, going on months, getting everything ready for this and letting us have a conference in the virtual standpoint when the live side of things was a lot more difficult. So that for the case of this presentation, yes, we can still watch and interact, even though it might not be as interactive as we might have liked to begin with. But what's that actually mean for us? What are we going to be talking about? Well, players aren't your only audience. That's it. That's the talk. The next hour of time is going to be largely elaborating on this incredibly simple point that it's going to feel like, well, of course, this is the case. Why are you even bothering telling me this? Having said that, when I'm talking to creators in the space, when I'm talking to journalists in the space, even when I'm talking to players in this space, people may realize at a certain level that, okay, players aren't your only audience. But there's still a mental hierarchy of, well, yeah, all sorts of people are exposed to what I'm making, but it's the players I really care about. It's those people who are taking action. That's where things get exciting. That is the danger of the space, and that is the big thing that over the next hour I'm going to be looking to dispel. But before we get into that, I'm just going to tell you a bit of a story, a bit of an aside. Did you know that when you go into office buildings, they've got those video ad units and elevators? Those are not expensive to buy. Like I used to work in the Wanamaker building in Philadelphia. And when I looked up how much it would cost to take out an ad in the elevators, I found out, oh, for the low cost of $65, I could subject over 1,000 people in the building, many of them coworkers, to pretty much any message I want. And they'd have to deal with it. So obviously I took out an ad for the unofficial Wanamaker Ghost Hunting Society and told people through that elevator video ad, hey, go to wanamakerghosts.com. And yes, for those of you watching who are wondering, you can still go to wanamakerghosts.com and follow along with this very short adventure. So great, you got an elevator ad telling people to join a ghost hunting society. When you follow through to the website, it's exactly what it sounds like. You are driven to the unofficial hub for paranormal investigations at the Wanamaker building. And there's a series of videos you can watch of just security cam footage of my office. Pretty straightforward. I mean, there's an email where you can say, hey, join if you want to take part in all of this. But a lot of the point of me doing this weird elevator ad asking people to join a ghost hunting society was so that I could put on a white sheet, run around the office over the weekend, and film footage of a ghost haunting the Wanamaker building. Again, if you go to wanamakerghost.com, you can check this out. There's 4 videos of someone who may or may not be me under a sheet doing various activities within the office as a potential ghost. Now, this is something that I really get excited about just because I like this type of hijinks of how do you use platforms that are in the real world for storytelling methods that aren't necessarily as intuitive. But the broader term for a lot of this type of activity is alternate reality games. And for me to dive into what we're going into here, I need to give you the requisite brief definition of what alternate reality games are. So the 4 factors that are typically held up for what is an alternate reality game is, first, you need to have a story or narrative. I'm not going to lie to you. If you check out wanamakerghost.com, there is not much of a story or narrative. There is a ghost hunting society. You can join the ghost hunting society. And if you attempt to join the ghost hunting society, you may get an email saying that it's been disbanded, but don't worry, there are absolutely no ghosts in the office. It's all fine. Really straightforward, incredibly simple. Two, distributed across multiple channels. This is something where, yeah, I took out an elevator ad. So part of my story was, hey, there's this organization you can join. That flows into the website that is a really crappy Tumblr website that I threw up for next to nothing. And there's a series of videos and even that email stinger at the end that lets this kind of loose story of what is going on with the Ghost Hunting Society spread out across channels. Number three is where things get really interesting. Players have to either have agency or the illusion of agency to advance the narrative. This is an area where, I'm not going to lie, my Wanamaker Ghost Hunting Society kind of fell flat, because you as the player can follow through and take the steps of saying, I am going to dig in for more information. But the story here has already happened. You're serving kind of as an archaeologist, digging up and putting together the pieces of what happened before. A lot of times with alternate reality games, you're dealing with story hooks where if players don't take action, either things don't move forward or things move forward in a different fashion. The last of the criteria is number four, where and this is where it gets really complicated, you're assuming a version of yourselves who believes that everything is actually taking place, but you are playing a version of yourself who is slightly more gullible. A lot of this boils down to the idea of suspension of disbelief. When I pick up a fiction book and I'm reading through it, I don't shout at the characters saying, you're not real, why am I reading this? The same when I'm interacting with elevator ads or websites or even chatting with characters. I'm still me. I'm just a version of me who isn't necessarily going to call 911 immediately when you find out there's been a kidnapping. Within the space of alternate reality games, this is referred to as the concept of this is not a game. But the general framework of what alternate reality games are taps into these 4 points. Having said that, alternate reality games, the communities, and alternate reality games, the definition, are two very different things. I wouldn't say that there is an alternate reality games community per se. There are people who are interested in certain genres of stories that follow within these constraints. And there's people who are interested in treating these 4 factors of what an alternate reality game is as toggles and sliders, where you might have something like what I created with Wanamaker Ghost, where there's very little story or narrative, where there's very little agency involved, but you're really playing up on this is something that is a story that takes place across channels. This is something that really you are doing a version of yourself for it. So when you're talking about alternate reality gaming communities, what you're really talking about is different toggles and sliders across those categories. So when I write for ARGN.com about this type of stuff, I'm not only writing about alternate reality games, because for the community, what they're more interested in is what happens when you play with these elements as factors of storytelling. And related areas to this, you're dealing with live action role-playing games, where there's twice a year, there's an event in the Pennsylvania area called Dragon Thrones, which is a combination of a blockbuster LARP and a mega game that's kind of a multiplayer action-based board game, where we dress up as Game of Thrones style characters and run around acting like idiots for the weekend. It's a wonderful time. But for that side of things, if we were to take that same list of what is in an alternate reality game, well, this is very story and narrative heavy, that because this is something where some of the action is happening on a board game, some of it is happening with real life interactions with other players, some of it's happening with coded messages and pieces of paper that you find along the way. It's definitely distributed across channels. And with live action role playing, this is an area where player agency is ramped up to extreme levels, where players are in many ways driving what happens in the story. The area it gets interested is you're not playing a version of yourself, you're assuming the role of a separate fictional character. So with Dragon Thrones and a lot of live action role-playing games, this is something that's still checking a lot of those boxes of what does interactive and immersive media look like, but the settings are a little off. The toggles are slightly different. With immersive theater, you're seeing a lot of the same things where, again, this isn't universal, but a lot of times you're seeing that it is going to be something that's very story driven. It is going to be something that plays out across a lot of media, but the constraint on that playing out across channels is very much going to be tied to a location and tied to a space. And then you might be seeing some games where you're assuming a role. You might be seeing some games where you are playing a version of yourself. With Sleep No More, you're very much putting on a mask and being that passive observer. With games like Rogues Gallery, which again had a little bit of LARP action going on it, a little bit of mega game action going on it, you are assuming the role of a supervillain who is trying to take over the world because a hero ended up dying, and there is a hole in world security that you can take advantage of. Transmedia storytelling is another one of those areas where it's all about how the toggles are set, where with transmedia storytelling, that's the umbrella term that alternate reality games fall under, where its definition is very focused on you are telling a distributed narrative across channels. But for them, that question of agency, often the toggle is set to you don't really need to have agency and you're following along the way with that story. Having said that, the example I pulled here is Curtis Chen, who's one of the guys who helped start Puzzled Pint, has a series of books that start with Waypoint Kangaroo. And if you buy the Waypoint Kangaroo book or just go to the website at before.waypointkangaroo.com, you're shown the cover of the book, and there's a secret puzzle in that cover. Once you solve that first puzzle, you're given a prequel experience that plays out as a puzzle-driven text adventure, so that you're introduced to that world, you're introduced to that character, where instead of the main character acting as the spy, you are acting as the spy's assistant, leading them along the way while you're meeting them as a character. With puzzle trails and escape rooms, this is an area where the story and narrative is actually the toggle that can be tamped down and be a lot lighter than everything else, where a lot of times with escape rooms in particular, you'll see it's not as focused on telling a unified story or narrative, and some of the rooms will dive down on let's go deep on the theming. The MIT Mystery Hunt is another one of those interesting hybrid examples where this is a weekend-long puzzle adventure that goes on the MIT campus, where you've got upwards of 1,000 people converging on campus in 60-plus player teams to compete to win the coin, which means they're responsible for running the next year's hunt. A terrifying responsibility to win here. Because you've got different teams running it every year, the balance is going to look different of what the experience is. But sometimes you have very narrative-based experiences where what you're seeing pictured there is one year they took the theme of the Inside Out movies, and you're working with the players' emotions to try to get them controlled, in line, in check, and taken advantage of, so that you as the player can win the hunt, get the coin, and then your team that has been driving that player character, who's also a character, can go through for the win. Very confusing stuff. But one of the things that's a common thread through all these examples of what's going on in alternate reality gaming, what's going on in that broader construct of immersive storytelling, presupposes that these are things that you're verbing. These are things that you are actively doing and participating in and taking efforts to drive forward. So you'd think, as somebody who has spent over a decade writing about a genre that's all about, hey, let's talk about doing, let's talk about getting out there, let's talk about playing, I would be all about, listen, this is something where you just can't experience it without playing. And yet, for all of these spaces, immersive viewing, that idea of watching without playing, is actually the major way that people consume these properties. People will passively watch other people's fun, and it scratches a very different itch. Now, you see this within the puzzle community, where I don't know if any of you guys have come across this stream yet, but there's a YouTube channel called Cracking the Cryptic. And it's run by Mark Goodliff, Simon Anthony, and they are very good at logic puzzles. They are extremely good at logic puzzles, and you get to watch them do Sudoku puzzles, Sudoku variants, and all sorts of types of that often numeric-based puzzle, where you are watching somebody else solve a puzzle where after you've seen it, you're probably not going to be able to solve it yourself. And yet here you've got a Sudoku variant where with the normal rules of Sudoku, you can only have the number 1 through 9 appear once in each box. Here they added additional constraints where on those blue diagonals, you can only have 1 through 9 appear once. And every number has to be unique, a chess move away from itself. So with that 4, there are 8 other places on the grid that can't be a 4 purely because it's there. And if you did a chess knight's move away, that would be a repeat of that number. Now, this is something where, again, crosswords, Sudoku puzzles, a lot of puzzles are something that are designed with play in mind. And yet here you've got a video that people have watched 3.7 million times, because sometimes the appeal of these puzzles isn't solving it yourself. It's watching somebody else be a hero and watching somebody else do really impressive stuff. John Rogers, who's one of the Leverage writers, came up with the expression competence porn to describe that idea of people really liking to watch people be good at stuff. But for that puzzling space, this is an area where you would think, okay, this is a pure play area. You can't watch and really get something out of it. No, with puzzles, it is very entertaining to watch people go through it. And for most of the examples of what I was talking about for alternate reality games in the extended universe, there are examples of wildly popular shows that are based around that concept of it can be fun to watch this stuff. So one of my recent addictions is there's a Netflix series called Busted that is the Korean variety show version of a mystery night or escape room, where you've got a bunch of variety show celebrities who aren't necessarily that good at puzzling, who aren't necessarily that good at figuring out the whodunits of who's the murderer, but you get to follow along with the process for them and see some ridiculous stunts along the way. And the story that they've created is very compelling with a lot of twists and turns. You've also got, from the live action role-playing side of things, Sagas of Sundry, where Sagas of Sundry takes the core tabletop game Dread. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Dread, it's a tabletop game where instead of rolling the dice to make decisions about whether things go well or poorly, you take a pull from a Jenga tower. And every time you need to do something important, you have to pull something else from the Jenga tower. Now, if you pull it fine, everything's fine and dandy. You succeeded. If you ask to do something stupid, you may have to pull multiple Jenga tower tiles. But when things go wrong and that tower topples, things go horrendously wrong. With Sagas of Sundry, they remix that idea of tabletop gaming with what you see more in the immersive theater area, where they set up an expansive film set where sometimes, yes, they're completing missions by pulling from the Jenga tower, but other times they may walk into a room, be given a sledgehammer, and have to break through a wall to get into the next phase of the story. You also have Escape the Night, which is sort of the Americanized version of Busted that's been going around, I think, a little bit longer than Busted, where Escape the Night takes a bunch of YouTube stars and really focuses on that escape room mechanic, but then pulls in a bunch of people who are just as interested in the live action role-playing side of things as they are in solving the puzzles. So sometimes you'll see these characters acting outside of their interests as competitors, as players, and according to their interests is driving their characters forward and establishing the scenes. Whodunit, you've got more of the straightforward reality show structure, where this is a competitive reality show, where if you did the worst job of guessing who died in the last murder and how, congratulations, you're the murder victim in the next episode. Now, all of these are examples of people watching immersive entertainment for some and transforming that into passive entertainment for others. And there's a lot of interesting tricks and tips that you can do for that, where this is one of the first puzzles that happened in Escape the Night, where it was a search the room puzzle, where they were supposed to find a series of books and figure out there is information on those book covers that will help them proceed. Now, one of the interesting things about designing for viewable puzzles and experiences versus experienced puzzles is something that's fun in one context is not necessarily always fun in another. In this case, although it's very fun, at least on my end, to hunt through escape rooms and try to find the hidden objects, it's less fun to watch that experience because you can't solve along with it. So the creators of the show added some editorial tricks where they would use graphics to highlight areas that you could focus on to really help the viewers who are not playing directly follow along and feel like they're playing as well. In this case, you've got a series where, as I said, this is wildly popular. You've got over 24 million views of the first episode alone of people really excited about, I want to watch other people who I admire as actors, who I admire as creators, go through an escape room, and I get to vicariously experience that. Now, there is some bleed through where for Escape the Night, after having 2 seasons of an escape room that you could only watch, they actually used a lot of the props and set pieces to make a real escape room in Los Angeles that was a limited time run where you as the viewer could shift into that player role and tackle the missions yourself. Yeah, in case you haven't noticed, I'm more than a little obsessed with Busted. It's a delightful show. But even when you're dealing with alternate reality games and experiences that are designed to be played and to be experienced, you're seeing a lot of that flow through happen. Where Black Watchmen is a delightful alternate reality game that's set up in a series of a couple dozen missions where you are given some artifacts in digital form. And by digging into those artifacts, you may solve a puzzle by finding a puzzle involved with it, or you may solve a puzzle by finding out you need to go to a separate website, figuring out an email to contact, and then socially engineering that person to give up information that you need using email autoresponders. Marvelous experience, something that is best played if you are in it for the puzzles, the mystery, and the unfolding experience. But it is also something that you can watch and vicariously get that competence porn appreciation out of it, where here you've got the Diesel Designs Gaming YouTube channel ended up filming a couple of the episodes as playthroughs, and you've got 78,000 people who went through and watched the first mission to get a sense of, what's this like? How cool is this? Do I actually want to dive into this? A lot of what I've talked about so far is more the puzzle-oriented side of things, though. So I'm going to transition a little bit into more the pure alternate reality game side of things. So I Am Sophie. I Am Sophie is an alternate reality game that launched in February, and it's centered around influencer culture, where the main character of I Am Sophie, as you might imagine, starts out as Sophie. And you're following through this satire of what it is like to be an influencer and a lot of the trade-offs that are going on with that, where it starts off fairly normal and then things get weirder and it turns into a horror story, and then it becomes something that people dig into. Now, people have dug into this. You're seeing launched in February, 1.5 million views already, over 16 videos. That's incredible. Where things get interesting is the story itself is taking place on I Am Sophie. This is where the experience sits. And yet, more people have experienced I Am Sophie as condensed through other YouTubers explaining what's going on than they have by seeing it directly. Where even if you take the assumption that every single person who watched one of these videos also watched every other one of them you're dealing with more people have heard about I Am Sophie and have had people walk them through and explain the cool stuff going on with I Am Sophie than have actually experienced themselves. Now, I've heard people, and even for some of the creators who've been making these explainer videos and going through and theory crafting, there is that struggle of, are these videos replacing I Am Sophie, the traditional series? And the answer to that is no, but it's complicated. That the bridge of going through and experiencing something, of saying, I'm going to commit to those 16 videos and spend the 5+ hours to figure out what's going on, is a very high hurdle to go through. And a lot of times these explainer videos are helping people figure out, oh, that seems really cool. Either I want to passively follow along through watching the series, or I'm invested and I want to find another way of following through. And it's that idea of having a companion guide to Ulysses and something to help you along the process with this that's really a big part of the involvement of what it is like to watch alternate reality games and watch these experiences without playing it directly. Now, I'm talking to a games audience. A lot of you make interactive fiction. This is not news to you. People have been doing Let's Plays, people have been doing watch-alongs, people have been doing theory videos in this space for years. And it's just part of the standpoint of mentally how you frame, how you feel about this is going to be different from creator to creator. You've got companies like Nintendo who are notoriously opposed to the fact that people can watch along with games and might be replacing that activity with it. But that's where we get to the theory part of this talk. Because here is where we get into phenomenology, swimming metaphors, and you. Starting off with phenomenology. So this is going to be by far the most complicated part of my talk. I apologize for it. Dead German philosophers have really complicated philosophies going in. But a lot of what I've learned about phenomenology is through a researcher and creator within the alternate reality game space named Brian Clark. And his way of explaining the relationship of phenomenology and a lot of experience design and interactive storytelling in general is when you are thinking about the creative process, the object, the thing that you have created is not and never should be at the center of your consideration of how games are experienced. It is all about having the audience at the center of the experience. Now, with phenomenology, you have the object, which in the cases of what we're talking about here is the game that people are playing. But then there is also the phenomenon of that audience member experiencing the object. And many times, those two are not the same thing. Those two can be very different things. So in the picture you're seeing there, you've got a little meeple standing there and looking at the top of a pyramid. That audience member is not seeing your story Bible. That audience member is not seeing your planning documents. Your audience member usually isn't seeing the source code of the project, but that sometimes happens. What is important for that audience member's experience is what they actually experience, what they observe. Now, the concept of phenomenology, amusingly enough, is an example of my own phenomenological experience because it was created by, as I mentioned, 4 dead German philosophers like Husserl and Heidegger. But I never actually read their works. Everything that I know about phenomenology and everything that I'm communicating to you now was based on listening to discussions by Brian Clark, talking with him, and a community of people engaging with this idea of what phenomenology is. Because where things really branch out is for that first meeple that we were talking about. That first meeple is looking at the pyramid, and they are observing the object and getting a sense of what that phenomenon is. But everybody else there you're seeing in that picture, they're getting a mediated experience through that audience member. So every audience member is their own unique data point and their own unique perspective on what a game is. This is not something where when you make a game, you have made a single game that many people play. You have made thousands of different games that thousands of different people are experiencing in very different way. Sometimes that's as you intended. A lot of times it's not. Now, this has been deep in theory talks. I'm going to get a little bit more practical here as I talk about Tender, an alternate reality game that was made for Bloodlines 2, the Vampire the Masquerade game that's coming back soon. Now, what I just said now may have introduced you to the fact that, oh, there was an alternate reality game for a Vampire the Masquerade game. That's cool. I didn't know about that before. You didn't engage with the property in any way, shape, or form, and yet you now know more about it than you did before. But even for people who engaged a little bit more directly, what that looks like changes. So one person might have found the Tender beta dating site, and yeah, the Tender alternate reality game about vampires was centered around a vampire dating site, where as you're signing up to meet the love of your life, your soulmate in this case, you need to give your blood type. And you're giving information that's talking about how anxious you might be that in the world of Vampire the Masquerade influences what your blood tastes like. And for many people, their experiences with Tender was just, oh my goodness, somebody for Valentine's Day put out a vampire dating site. That's hilarious. Other people may never have went to the website, but heard popular streamers talking about, oh, hey, there's this weird dating site going on. So person B never even took a look at the website, but still has that experience of what's going on filtered through people talking about their experiences of signing up for the dating site. Some people may have missed the game as a whole while it was going on and only heard after the finale event, holy heck, did you hear that there was a fake launch event for a dating site that ended up with most of the creators and programmers getting slaughtered because of the masquerade potentially being violated? That person might turn around, and because they didn't experience it directly, they check out what are the player resources for this. So dive in and check the wiki, figure out what is going on, what can we learn about this crazy experience. But things get even more complicated, because what happens when person A talks about their experiences to person C? Both of them had unique experiences that differ in many ways, and they have different information. So that exchange of information between players, viewers, and experiencers is itself part of the experience. Okay, having gotten through the hard part of theory talk, now we get to a little bit easier point of it. Now, with phenomenology, the core concept is your audience is at the center, so that when you are creating a game, you are creating thousands of games. Designing thousands of games is horrible, it's terrifying, it's a headache. Even with interactive fiction, where you're building out the branching storylines, you don't think of it as thousands of storylines. You have modes and models to compress that into something easier. In the context of alternate reality games, Campfire NYC, who's worked on games for everything from Game of Thrones, True Blood, and even Audi, their concept for this was breaking those experiences and breaking those players up into three groups: skimmers, dippers, and divers. Now, what you've heard from the names of these is exactly what the experiences are. Skimmers go for more of that surface level look and get the base understanding of what's going on. Dippers will dive a little bit deeper in, but that doesn't always mean they go to the level of they're actively playing and they are fully engaged with the property directly. A lot of the dipper level is dealing with following and engaging with the community that has formed around the game as opposed to the game itself. The divers is where we're really talking about, where people traditionally talk about them as players. And this is dealing with that very hard balance of, in general, the rule of thumb is the higher you are on this triangle, the more accessible it is for somebody to get a sense of what's going on. The lower on, it might be more investment and more effort for you to support them. Now, this isn't just a gaming term. This isn't just an entertainment term. This is something where if you see in business and marketing concepts, people talking about the 90-91 rule, the Pareto principle, comes up all the time. But the important thing here is you've got a framework of different player archetypes. I am not saying that this is a funnel that you drive people down, because for one thing, if everybody who engaged with your property went down to the diver level, you as creators would be broken. You appreciate and like this balance because it's really servicing people with what they need and giving them an experience that is tailored to what they're looking for at that time. As Campfire highlighted on the slide, this is something where the audience types are self-selecting. Going through a specific example, this is something where Stranger Things did an alternate reality game for the most recent season. Now, when I say Stranger Things did an alternate reality game, you might actually be going through a bunch of different possibilities of what happened. Is Michael talking about how Nike ended up pretending that they lost a shipment of shoes from it in 1985 and that the truck magically reappeared in 2019 with the Hawkins High collection going out? You might be thinking that Microsoft re-released Windows 1.1 and did another throwback dealing with what does it look like to have an experience built around old versions of Windows. I'm not talking about either of those. I'm diving into the delightful world of ice cream, where at the skimmer level, Baskin-Robbins created two or three Scoops Ahoy branded locations that they put around the world. And then for all Baskin-Robbins locations, if you go there, they'd have little bits of branding from the show to follow through. Now, what I just described there is more than enough for you to get a sense of what was going on. I just gave you a 1-minute version of what happened with the Baskin-Robbins alternate reality game, and that's enough. You got, oh, that's a cool thing. For people who dove in a little bit deeper, though, at that dipper level, they might have gone to the location and noticed that there's a Russian code wheel on the windows within the location. They might have noticed that there's Morse code in some of the ice cream flavors located there. And that leaves them on to figure out, oh, I can follow this, and people are talking about this on Reddit. There's a Discord dedicated to breaking down what's happening there. And for people who really went over the deep end, they could use some of the information they learned there to pick up an IP address that came through, set up an SSH connection to it, to connect to a portal that lets them play this interactive text adventure puzzle game that plays out like a version of Keep Talking and Nobody Explodes, where you're going through operating manuals that are contained within the game to send information to teams that are working to control portal breaches at remote locations like 3 Mile Island. And this is an experience where I just told you, wow, there's this really cool interactive text adventure you can play. It's not live now. It's something where, yes, you're seeing a picture of facing down that portal and going through the Demodog there with a really cool look and feel for it, but I can't completely convey what happened there. And part of designing for that skimmers, dippers, and divers mentality is making sure that you're designing something that feels special and works at each of those levels. So when you're dealing with players, you're asking questions like, do they actually feel compelled to share? Do they feel empowered to share? And what context is that? But also, how is that experience personal to them? What do they feel that they can hold back as a surprise for others? An example on this side of things is I mentioned that I do the MIT Mystery Hunt every year. And for this year with the puzzle Under Control, you're seeing we would send one of our players into a room with a green screen. And there was a live stream set up where we could watch what was happening in that room on a YouTube live stream and interact through the YouTube comments, but those YouTube comments would be ported into the room with our player at a 10 to 15 second delay, so that when we're doing a interactive rock, paper, scissors dance battle, it becomes very difficult to figure out how to tell that player, in order to beat Walk Like an Egyptian, point to your crotch. That was not an easy thing to do. And I can show you the 40-minute video of our team trying to solve this. That doesn't capture the frustration, the hilarity of having our team shouting at each other to talk less, talk more, try to describe it this way, of solving that puzzle and working through it. It's something that's very exciting for me to tell you about, but it doesn't completely capture what's going on. With the casual fans at the Dipper level, this is something that you're seeing is incredibly popular, specifically within the game space, because it is the area where you see a lot of that theory crafting going on, where with Five Nights at Freddy's, what types of stories will be told about the games, how do those stories enhance gameplay and replace it, and does that generate excitement of people getting into what's your next big thing? What's really interesting in the video game space for this is a lot of times the games that are created for the casual fans at that Dipper level are completely divided from the games that you're actually playing. With Five Nights at Freddy's, if you're playing the video game Five Nights at Freddy's, you're in a room and you're trying to not get jump scared for a couple minutes. That's it. That's the game. If you shift into that online commentary space, it's about figuring out what happened, what led that character to be in the room. You're seeing that all over the place, with Fortnite having experiences where each season is a compartmentalized story that has almost nothing to do with the gameplay itself. The gameplay is just a place for hiding artifacts for that other story. Overwatch is a video game where the only thing that is not canonical to the story of Overwatch is the video game Overwatch itself. And then when you're designing, and this is often the part that gets left out the most, it's what do you do for the curious? What kind of elevator pitch moments can you give players so that they can excitedly talk about with Why So Serious, the Dark Knight ARG? At one moment, a dozen or so players were sent to bakeries and said, hey, ask for a pickup for Robin Banks. When they get the pickup, they're given this cake with a cell phone number on it. I'll dial the cell phone number and the cake starts ringing. Tear open the cake, figure out, oh my goodness, there's a burner phone inside this cake with another phone number to call and a Joker card as reward for you did this. This may be something that was an intensely personal experience for those dozen people, but that sales pitch of this is the crazy stuff that game got up to is a lot of what lives on for the game. Which brings us to our last section, where we're talking about case studies of living vicariously and finding ways for vicarious play. Going to speed through this a little bit because I've talked a lot, but these are just examples of ways that people have played around with that question of how do I design experiences where it's not only with the player in mind. So you've got the Jejune Institute. Jejune Institute, alternate reality game that ran back in 2008 to 2011. And that game was about running around and exploring the city of San Francisco. The game ended. You can't play it anymore. Except that transitioned into, because they were filming along the way for the project, the pseudo-documentary, The Institute, that's running people who wanted to watch this vicarious experience of, oh my goodness, what could I do, and experience it that way. More recently, you've got an even more fictionalized version of that, Dispatches from Elsewhere, where it became a fictional construct that a news story got plugged into, where the experience even got moved, where instead of happening in San Francisco for the television series, it happens in Philadelphia and has a completely different structure for that. This is an area where, as creators, you have been benefiting and relying on the fact that people will film videos and celebrate the cool stuff you're doing. There are ways of turning that into a conversation, where IGN has a series of videos where they have developers reacting to speedrunners. And that's a very specific conversation that you can only really have from the developer angle, but tells a nuanced story of how do you give people viewable versions of your game. From the accessibility standpoint, story mode is a marvelous thing, where for people who don't want to as actively engage with your game, there is a way that they can still vicariously support it and give you money along the way. You also have that idea of taking that a little bit further, spectator mode, where Spies the Play is an immersive play that ran in Philadelphia that sold 3 tiers of tickets. And at that cheapest tier of tickets, you could sign up to attend the play without being responsible for interacting yourself. That isn't something that appealed to people as a ticket price because oh, I don't want to pay as much for this project. That appealed as a tier for tickets because some people just want to watch. And if you give people the choice to just watch, some people will absolutely jump at that opportunity. I've gone to immersive theater plays where I've been sitting next to family of the creators, and they whispered, oh gosh, I hope we don't get called up again. Because some people don't want to play, they want to watch other people play. Black Watchmen is something where I talked a little bit before about their mission-based structure. Part of their structure also involves taking that pool of dedicated hardcore players and every quarter or so, highlighting one of those players, flying them out to a location, and having them be the center of an experience where the rest of the player base helps out. Now, when I say the rest of the player base helps out, some of them can be working through solving the puzzles, helping through the narrative hooks, and aiding this remote player as they're guided through a ridiculous, individually designed experience. But I've just watched sometimes. It's great fun to just watch and see what happens, because with real people involved in it, that changes the nature and character of what you're watching. The other thing you can play with is that idea of absolute discretion and secrecy, where one of my favorite Discord games is made by James Lance, who you might have heard at other parts of the conference, was part of the team who made Hey Robot. And this is a Discord bot that plays out primarily through direct messages. And you can't see what other players are doing, but you can see the results of their actions. It's just the results of those actions make absolutely no sense until you have the context to understand it. That is my sales pitch for having this game installed on the NarraScope servers after the game, because if I tell you any more, I worry that I might be spoiling some of the secrets of what made this so special. And players will recognize and embrace those areas where you carve out, and there are certain things that are special, that are reserved for, you just need to do it. I've watched all sorts of playthroughs of Bennett Foddy, never played it myself. But that last moment, what happens when you beat Bennett Foddy? That's something that I don't know, because that was reserved for the people who played through. And for the most part, those players respected the decision to say, if you get over it with him, you get to figure out what you got over it for. The reality, though, is a lot of this is mixed models, where with Unknown 9, you've got a game where they're managing open secrecy at different levels. They had a marvelous 40-plus puzzle trail that was designed for individuals and small groups to go through. But they also had modules for other interactivity points. They had a podcast that you could just listen to. They had live events where if you're going there, oh boy, you're getting initiated into a cult. They've got a novel you can read. And each had their own unique rules of engagement. Each had their own unique ways of dealing with it. That picture you're seeing in the bottom right of the screen right now is from one of the puzzles, where there was a Twitter account that was created that over the course of a couple weeks tweeted thousands upon thousands of characters that, if you assembled in the right size grid, would give you a picture with the solution to the puzzle. Insane stuff. That element was public. A lot of the more individualized puzzles through the higherknowledge.institute website, which, by the way, also still playable, you have different balances for that. But back to the topic of ghosts. I'm going to share a couple metrics of a failed experiment that I have. I started out telling you this is a really exciting thing that I did. Aren't I proud of how cool it was that I haunted my coworkers? I kind of haunted my coworkers, because I may have taken out an ad that 1,000+ tenants could have seen, but practically only 7 people actually went to the website while those ads were airing. Now, realistically, this makes perfect sense that it's an abject failure. People don't pay attention to elevator ads. Even if they did, who the heck goes to the websites or even remembers to go to the websites that you see mentioned in the elevators? Elevators often don't have good Wi-Fi connections, so you've got to wait anyway. This was a horrible waste of $65. Why would I do this? Well, that's the entire point of this talk. I didn't do this with only players in mind. The real numbers behind this experience are not just the 7 people who went to it while it was running and you can actually see the elevator ad. it expands out. Well, and one of those 7 people, by the way, was a very confused Health and Human Services employee, because apparently the Wanamaker building has a couple government offices in it. But expanding beyond that, once I shared to people, this is a thing that happened. This is a phenomenon. This is a thing that happened, is what got people excited. That's what really lit people's flames of, oh, that's cool. And it's got over 400 visits of people going to something that I don't really publicly advertise that much. That for those YouTube videos themselves, there's over 800 people who've watched through me running around the office like an idiot in a sheet, because the point of this experience was not, oh, there was an elevator ad that led to a website that led to an email that almost nobody wrote. The point of this experience was it was crafting different ways of interacting with it for different people. To such an extent where, and I still can't believe this happened, when I went back to Philadelphia, because I have a new job now for PAX Unplugged, I visited the office, and I was introduced to some of the coworkers that I've never met because they started after I did this, as that guy who haunted our building we told you about. This is something where play, exposure, and experience are very different but equally important things. So I started off this presentation by saying players aren't your only audience. Design with that in mind. And I am reaffirming that right now, as you're taking the phenomenological look at what does it look like to craft interactive stories. You are crafting thousands of experiences for thousands of people, many of whom will never actually buy your product, never actually know who you are, never actually even necessarily know the name of your game. That doesn't mean that their experiences are less valuable. It does mean that they're having a different experience. Now, crafting thousands of experiences, really hard. So part of this is also transitioning into how can you build out models to think about cohorts of players and cohorts of people experiencing your games, so that you're designing not just for those super fan 20%, 1% bottom of the funnel people, but you're designing for everyone to experience it in a way that benefits you, because those experiences and those conversations drive people's awareness of what you're doing, to potentially lead to purchases, to potentially lead to awareness, to potentially lead to people being excited enough to talk about your next project. And with that, I'm ending the long rant and going into the important part of questions. So again, before I get into the question side of things, thank you, NarraScope. I cannot stress enough how wonderful it's been following along remotely and engaging, both as a more passive consumer of these sessions as a more active consumer going through all of this. It's been a wonderful week. So the shameless self-promotion side of things for that is going to be ARGN.com. Infrequently writes about it, but does write about the topic. A lot of this is going to be the question of which versions of these experiences are you interested in, that for a lot of the folks who are really dedicated and write a lot more than I do on the topic, No Proscenium will focus a lot on the immersive theater side of things, but given the quarantine and COVID, they've been expanding a lot into those remote experiences that are still more digital location centric. Room Escape Artist doesn't just focus on escape rooms. They broaden on into a lot of the puzzle conversations. And on the YouTube side of things, a lot of what I've said in terms of theory crafters, they're really paving the way, where Loey Lane, Inside a Mind, Night Mind, a lot of creators who are doing incredible work documenting not just what's going on with current games, but what's happened with historical games. Also along those lines, you've got a bunch of podcasts where there's an Argonauts podcast that'll go through and give very much the phenomenological experience of what are these historical games, by only doing an archival version of digging through the records of games as opposed to talking to players, so that you get a very curious, what is the experience of observing a game after the fact. Also, you've got No Proscenium's got a podcast that goes through it. So yeah, a lot of resources out there. And part of that challenge is just finding which corners of this community and which elements of creation you're interested in. Discord is very big within the video gaming space of people who are excited about it, where there's a game detective subreddit in addition to the r/args one, all sorts of places. And I will cut off the rant there because that is probably enough to start. Oh boy, I'm going to get the name of this book wrong. So Andrea Phillips wrote a book called The Creator's Guide to Transmedia Storytelling that is a very good introductory guide to the practicalities of setting things up. Dave Saborsky, who is one of the early creators within the field behind projects like Chasing the Wish, has a book called This Is Not a Game. That is not to be confused with Walter John Williams' book, This Is Not a Game, which is also about alternate reality games, but is a fictionalized version of it. Those are kind of the two big book resources out there. But if you check the archives, while it's not active anymore, there used to be an IGDA special interest group dedicated to alternate reality games that has listservs with a lot of back and forths for the conversation. And there was a Story Forward podcast that's had a lot of episodes that were specifically focused on interviewing creators and getting that sense of what's going on. There's also a bunch of academics in the space, like Patrick Jagoda, that I should be shouting out, who have been focusing more on the research side of how do you discuss, how do you document, and how do you create games, often with the academic center to it. Jeff Watson with USC, who worked on the game Reality, which is an alternate reality game designed for cinema students to remain engaged with the practicalities of creation at the same time that they're working on learning theory. I think that's another, I rambled on enough for the quick fire version of that. Yes, if any of these sound interesting, I can follow up with links because I know I'm talking quickly. No, absolutely, it was a pleasure. One of the things that I'm going to be dropping in the Discord is the first link is I have an annotated version of the PowerPoint deck that has, for most of the directly referenced links, links going out to it, and then I can do some hunting for stuff that might not have been captured there as well.